Hi, everybody. Welcome back for the third week of Easter. And we get to talk about the Exodus today. Not the Exodus event itself, but the book of Exodus. We, last week and this week, have come out of Egypt and have begun the journey to Mount Sinai. And then this week in chapter 19, oh boy, here's Israel gathering at the base of the holy mountain. And I just love how chapter 19, what is it, like verses 16 through 22, describe the majesty of God's descent onto Mount Sinai, and then to see the people approaching with great trembling and fear. I mean, you can just picture the scene. I mean, it's like God's as big as a volcano on the top of that mountain, and the people are called forward to approach his presence on that mountain. And I think this is one of the most significant theophany events in the Bible, certainly in the Old Testament. We see God show up back in the creation. We see the Spirit hovering over the surface of the deep. There are instances where God appears to individuals in a number of different ways, but on Mount Sinai, and really, we've seen God, the pillar of fire and smoke, like there at the banks of the Red Sea when the people cross through. These are called theophanies. All right, a theophany is the manifest presence of God revealed for all to see. It's also called, and more traditionally, the Shekinah glory cloud of God. You see, God dwells in unapproachable light, and if he's going to show up, well, it means he's got to veil that glory for the protection of everyone around him. So it's a flaming fire on the inside. It's a radiant heat and light, brighter than the sun. And it is shrouded in a cloud, the glory cloud. And this is how God often shows up in the Bible. If he's going to come out, if he's going to show himself for all to see, this typically is how he does it. And what I'd like to do is just briefly trace the path of God's presence from Mount Sinai really to the return of Christ. All right, so let's just put our big picture view on here of the Bible, and you think of how God's presence moved from Mount Sinai into the tabernacle, which we're going to see later on in the book of Exodus, God's directions to make the tabernacle so that God's presence now travels with God's people in the tabernacle, and the tabernacle makes it possible for that holiness of God to dwell safely in the midst of God's people. And I want you to notice the emphasis on danger on this mountain. Don't cross the line, don't break through the boundary and come up into God's presence where he will then break out against you and people die. All right, so we don't want that. So you have to observe the boundaries, and that's what the tabernacle did. Now, once God's people settled in the Holy Land, once David had captured Jerusalem, well, we saw last year that the first thing he did was bring the Ark of the Covenant in there. And then as soon as Solomon was grown up and in power there as David's successor, king of Israel, he built the temple. And it's one of the most magnificent scenes. We'll see it when we get into our Old Testament series this summer. God's presence descends upon the temple of Solomon. The next time we see the presence mentioned in a vigorous way was in the book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel has a vision of the Shekinah glory, the glory cloud of God, rising from the temple and departing to the east over the mountain. And we never see him come again until Jesus. Now, God's manifest presence is veiled in flesh. And here's Jesus coming into the temple, and you see glimpses of his glory in the course of his ministry, especially, of course, on the Mount of Transfiguration. And we see him in glory ascending and seated at the right hand of God, now in the place, the true manifest presence of God. And we await him bringing that presence back to earth, where we will welcome him to finish the new creation. It's really a grand story arc, and that is it in the thumbnail sketch. Now, what you will notice here on this mountain, what's happening. God and his people are making a covenant. It's an agreement. There are things that God promises to do for his people, and it's a very nice little summary there in Exodus 19, verses 3-6. And notice in particular the phrase, "You will be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation." So this gaggle of former slaves rescued from Egypt on the journey through the wilderness, being formed by God's law, will be constituted in the Holy Land as a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. Now, I want you to remember from last week, Peter used that same language, like probably 13 or 1400 years later in his first epistle, chapter 2. He explicitly quotes right here from Genesis 19 to describe those Christian communities in Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey. He's explicitly identifying those names given to Israel. He's now associating those with the churches there, the followers of Jesus in the first century, both Jew and Gentile. And this is hugely significant because you'll recall how he described those Christian communities as being the temple of God, which replaced the Jerusalem temple, which would soon be destroyed by the Romans. Peter here is very explicitly transferring all those identity markers, those names, that calling of Israel to Jesus's people, the church. All right, so that's what God is promising to his people. You will be a holy nation, a royal priesthood. And then God's asking things in return. So he's like, this is what I'm promising you. Now I want you to promise me to obey what we call the 10 Commandments there in in Exodus 20. And then in chapters 21 and following, those 10 Commandments are elaborated into multiple statutes that are applied to different cases that would then govern the day-to-day life of God's people. By living according to this pattern, by living according to God's will, they will exhibit what it's like to be the new humanity. This is what people living in God's presence, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, looks like. And this was to have an evangelistic purpose so that all the nations of the earth who are in the darkness of idolatry, worshiping false gods, could see the liberty of God's people. So I hope you're enjoying the book of Exodus. And that's just a little big picture perspective to make each of those verses and chapters fit into the big context. So God bless you all. See you soon.